Hello, welcome to this HighByte Intelligence Hub training on templating. In this course, we'll start with an overview of templating, then we'll review static templating. This will be followed by dynamic templating, and then finally, we'll talk about parameterization. What is templating? Templating is a way to manage fewer Intelligence Hub configuration objects and quickly scale solutions. Template parameters provide the ability to take an Intelligence Hub configuration object from one to many. And this concept relies on commonality between source data sets. And we use this commonality to create patterns to virtually iterate through data. Template parameters can be statically driven from manual entries in the configuration object or dynamically by obtaining data from external sources. The benefit of templating is that it's necessary to manage fewer configuration objects. This results in overall solutions and projects that are more simple to manage and handle. Templating enables the data engineer to efficiently obtain, curate, and deliver large data sets. And when combined with dynamic references, templating ensures that the data is consistent in the target system. Multiple Intelligence Hub components can be templated, and this includes inputs, instances, and the pipeline flow trigger stage. So in a solution, the connection input could be templated so we can manage one configuration input to pull in many like data points. An instance might model those data points together, maybe adding context, perhaps from additional sources, to generate multiple models, perhaps for multiple assets or products or processes. In the pipeline flow stage, maybe we need to add some template parameters so that we can pass the parameters to those upstream configuration objects so that they can be used there. So in that way, the parameters are passed through each of the configuration objects, and each of the configuration objects in a solution are templated. Let's talk about template settings, some of the basic template settings. When you enable templating, you can see there's a handful of configuration objects. And let's start by talking about static templating, and that's what's being shown here. The static templating approach provides the ability to specify one or more parameters and patterns for those parameters, and also a name for the template. We'll talk about the pattern soon. Once a template is enabled, you can utilize the parameters in a this dot notation that you can see here in the template name. And that becomes an important syntax when we talk about templating. So let's talk about a scenario. So maybe the source system has commonality, perhaps for the asset ID for motors, and that's what we're showing here. And here we can use the identifier to go from one asset to many. So we'll obtain, data if this was a connection input for multiple motors here, 4 motors. So let's talk about dig in and talk about static templating. So here we can see how this dot syntax is replaced, in the pattern. So we have an identifier. This is a connection input and maybe a path to an OPC UA tag. And here we've parameterized it using the this dot notation, and that would substitute the parameters in that OPC UA path. The solution would then iterate through each of those parameters. So the impact is initially maybe when we did not parameterize and we were obtaining data just for the identifier motor 01, we would have a payload representing just one motor. But if we use parameters, motor 1 through 4, we obtain an array that contains the data for each of those 4 motors. When an object is templated, a template view is enabled on that object, and that's one of the tab options. And this is an easy way to see how the template parameters are being used and being passed. So here we can see that the template parameter name, motor01, and that template parameter is also being used in the tag path, and it's being used as the name of the template in instance. And then incidentally here, since we've included metadata, you can see that template parameter in the tag path that's being returned with the data set. Using a drop-down list, we can iterate through each of the different parameter names and individually test each named instance in this, or actually in this case, it's a connection input. For static parameters, there's a handful of ways to specify the patterns. So first, might be a discrete list of comma delimited values, and in this case, it's just M1, 2, and 3. The second, the second way to specify a pattern depicted here, it would be a range. So maybe 1 to 100 would handle all values between 1 and 100. And it's, of course, it's worth noting it wouldn't be practical, but this is the same as if you were just kind of comma separate the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 100. A string might need to be repeated and maybe, repeated a number of times. And here, hello is multiplied by 3, and the output would be hello, 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 comma separated. And then finally, we can see, in a discrete list of values, a quote can be used to escape characters, and the parameter patterns can get quite complex. Okay, so let's move on and talk about dynamic templating. A solution that uses dynamic templating can obtain the template parameters from an external source using the dynamic template types. Generally, the same principles apply as with static templating. The difference is we're referencing an external source as opposed to statically, and explicitly configuring the parameters. The external source must return an array of objects with the same schema keys for the template parameter names. So here, we're obtaining a list of machine IDs using a SQL query. So maybe this is being obtained from a database. So this would be using a separate connection, a connection to a SQL database. And what I need to do is make sure that whatever this named key is here is identical to the parameter name that I define. So here's an example. And what I've done is I've selected a dynamic template type. I've named the template. The machine ID is something that's being returned by this referenced SQL statement. So if I had performed this configuration and templatized a connection input, perhaps again using our OPC UA scenario that we were looking at for static templating, that would return a list, an array of all of the information for 4 different motors, and I would have passed in that motor ID 1 through 4 that I obtained from the SQL query. So let's talk about passing parameters between configuration objects, because as we said at the beginning of this training, it might be necessary perhaps to obtain data from multiple motors in this example, but I want to drive that from a pipeline and a flow trigger stage to an instance to a connection input. And I can use some syntax to do that. So keep in mind that template parameters remain local to the configured object, and they're not automatically passed downstream to the next configuration object in a solution. So if a solution includes a templated instance as a reference for a pipeline flow trigger stage, the flow trigger stage does not automatically receive the instance's template parameters. So we have to indicate that using some syntax. And here, The input ID is the template parameter name for a connection input, and the asset ID is the flow trigger stage's parameter. So we're taking a parameter from the flow trigger stage and passing it into the connection input. And we're using the this dot syntax to do that. So we have a parameter name that's been defined and is being used on the connection input. In this case, the upstream configuration object. And then we have the asset ID that's perhaps associated with a statically defined pattern or a pattern that's being obtained from a dynamic reference, a SQL query perhaps, and we pass that down to the connection input. And it's worth noting that we don't need to template the connection input because the key thing is just to make sure that we have that parameter name syntax um, associated with the uh, the tag path, for example, if it's an OPC connection input. Now, however, you may want to specify a single static value within the child object, within that OPC connection input, so that we could just simply be able to test it, so that you could test and verify that it's working and the connection input is working. But it would not have to be a templated connection input. So those are some things to consider related to templating, a powerful concept within Intelligence Hub. This concludes the basic overview of templating. Thank you for your time.